When Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th, everyone knew war would follow. But for 8 long months, in one of the world's most densely populated places, will the latest hopes of a truce once again be dashed? Critics contend that for leaders on both sides of this divide, managing a war is easier than ending it. After all, they run the risk of being held to account once it's over. Yet this time, could outside pressure finally bear fruits? What's new? Well, the opposition's quitting Israel's war cabinet. That gives Benjamin Netanyahu and his far-right coalition free rein, but also full responsibility for what happens next. There's also the UN Security Council, which doesn't agree on anything these days, yet it has agreed on a U.S. ceasefire resolution. Can Netanyahu still stick to his guns? And can Hamas continue to hold innocent hostages in urban areas with no regard to the dangers exposed on the innocent civilians all around? More broadly, how to finally get a deal over the line. Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking just how you do get to a ceasefire. With us, France 24's Shirley Sitbon. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Former president of Doctors Without Borders, MSF, Ronnie Broman. Good to see you.
Thank you.
And we're pleased to welcome from San Francisco, Palestinian-American writer Ahmed Fouad Al-Khatib, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council think tank. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Your reactions on the hashtag F24debate. Will it be 8th time lucky? 8 visits to the Middle East for Antony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, since October the 7th. Eliza Herbert has more on his messaging.
In Tel Aviv, protesters gathered outside a building where US Secretary of State Antony Blinken met with Israeli authorities. Their message was to the US to seal the deal. Blinken, on the other hand, said it was now up to Hamas and that the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had reaffirmed its commitment to a 6-week ceasefire plan after the UN Security Council adopted the resolution on Monday.
14 votes for, no votes against. Everyone's vote is in, except for one vote, and that's Hamas.
Hamas officials had welcomed the proposal on Monday.
Hamas welcomes what is included in the Security Council resolution that affirmed the permanent ceasefire in Gaza, the complete withdrawal, the prisoners' exchange, the reconstruction, and the return of the displaced to their areas of residence.
But according to Blinken, it's the Hamas leadership in Gaza that counts. Meanwhile, some Palestinians in Gaza were quick to note where US allegiances lie and what they see as complicity in the death toll that has climbed over 37,000, according to the Gaza Health Ministry.
We hope the Secretary of State Antony Blinken puts pressure on Israel for a ceasefire, because all the American support goes to Israel. Where are all these weapons and missiles coming from? From the United States. That can really put pressure on Israel. Stop this war and end the tragedy in Gaza.
Others called for the proposal to be implemented immediately, calling it a humanitarian mercy and the least the international community could do.
Shirley Sitbon, we hear the U.S. Secretary of State in that report putting the onus on Hamas in public, but is he also doing it on the Israelis? What do you think of his messaging? Can you explain it for us?
Well, I guess it's now saying that Israel, yes, let's imagine it's on board from what he seems to be saying. It's not that clear, but yes, the Americans really want to push this through. And we've seen actually in recent days a new attempt with some separate deals saying, at least for the American citizen, American nationals, there could be a separate deal between Hamas and the Americans without the Israelis. Maybe that's also playing in. The Americans who still in private try to push more Benjamin Netanyahu, who's now, as you've said, in this cabinet that doesn't have the centrists in it, that has these far-right ministers who want to play a greater role. So maybe, yes, the Americans will try and push Netanyahu to accept this deal, saying that the only problem, the only hurdle is Hamas.
It's the same strategy as recently when Joe Biden went on national television and said, Israel's offering a deal, and we're not quite sure if that's true.
Yeah, at the time also there were different proposals. The Israeli deal and the one accepted by Hamas were not the same. There were various differences. I don't know if you remember this, about if the hostages released at first were living hostages or living and also bodies, and the number of people released and the gap of time. So there were many differences. So this time, that's a thing. We don't have all the details yet, and this needs to be hammered out. And the Americans also saying that Hamas agrees in principle, but all the details, that's what matters really, and that still needs to be proved.
Over the weekend, Ahmed Fouad Al-Khatib, Israeli television station Channel 12, leaked a three-part plan in this deal, quite detailed. The Israeli government, in reaction, equivocating. So is Antony Blinken right with his message, his public messaging? Is that the right strategy at this point?
Well, I think what needs to be affirmed is that there needs to be a clear and unequivocal pathway to end the war. And I understand that the war started with Hamas and the buck ends with Hamas. However, they will not agree to any deal. To them, this is an existential crisis. And only a deal that entails the end of the war will be acceptable to Hamas. The other thing that folks are not realizing is that Hamas's political leadership and the Politburo in Qatar and elsewhere, they're mere messengers. They don't actually have control over what goes down in Gaza. Sinwar and Deif, who are using satellite phones, who have multiple tiers of couriers and messengers, they are the ones that are calling the shots. And they have made it very clear, both publicly through my conversations with people in Gaza, they will not accept anything short of ending the war. And that's, I think, what's missing is that we see reluctance on the Israeli side to make it clear what is the Israeli position vis-a-vis the end of the war.
Ahmed, tell us more about who you've been speaking to in recent days inside the Gaza Strip.
So I grew up in the Gaza Strip, and I have a network of friends and allies and family, or what remains of them. Unfortunately, I lost quite a few of them. But the reality is extremely dire. The people are extraordinarily fed up with the war. They're upset with Hamas, but they're also furious with the Israeli war machine that is ratcheting up the pressure. I was relieved for the freeing of the 4 hostages, including Noa Argamani, whom I know her family very personally, but was horrified by the high price and by what was entailed in this operation. The bombardment that took place not just in the Nusayrat camp, but in Deir al-Balah, where my brother is actually working. He works for a large international medical NGO, was horrendous. So to create a diversion away from Nusayrat, you had this saturation bombardment from the air, from the sea, from the land, and that cost a lot of civilian lives. And I'm also talking to people in Gaza who shared some disturbing testimonies, both first and secondhand, that confirmed some Israeli soldiers were killing on contact, meaning they were not discriminating with who they came in contact with as the operation was underway, that they were in fact shooting on sight. And I think that's incredibly disturbing. And that's why we have high civilian casualties. But again, the people in Gaza want an end to the war. There's no military victory. Hamas is degraded militarily. Hamas is weakened. But it cannot be eliminated by the way this war is being conducted. And that's why it has to come to an end through a negotiated political solution.
Hamas attacked on October the 7th, Roni Broman. Today's June 11th. Did you think we'd be in this situation today?
Well, I wouldn't say that I expected that or that anticipated that, but well, we observe it, we see as it is going.
Why is it lasting so long?
Well, I think that it's not in the interest of the Israeli Prime Minister to stop the war now. He wants to have a war until the U.S. elections. If he steps down, he goes maybe not straight to jail, but he's at risk of being judged and jailed in Israel for bribery, corruption, etc. So it's his own interest to go at war. Plus the fact that most of the Israeli population supports the war. They are against Netanyahu. They protest against the way the hostages are dealt with or are not dealt with. with the exception of the last this weekend success with the release of the liberation, let's say, of a handful of hostages. But generally speaking, most of the Israeli population is strongly supporting the war, the destruction of Hamas, a victory which no one is able to define, no one is able to describe. When will come the time when Netanyahu or the main military leaders say mission accomplished? Nobody knows this, but what is absolutely certain is that Netanyahu wants to continue the war until at least November.
And we are seeing, though, that the needle is moving. Just how fast, though, is the question. There have been more and more people attending anti-government demonstrations. On Sunday, Benny Gantz making good on his threat to quit the National Unity War Cabinet. He'd said he'd do it on June 8th if the Prime Minister hadn't formulated a clear long-term plan for Gaza and beyond. He postponed by a day when there was that rescue operation. In his speech on Sunday night, the former Army Chief of Staff, he's now the head of the centrist National Union Party, making less than subtle overtures to the Netanyahu's defense minister, hoping Yoav Gallant can defect and bring along with him enough members of parliament from the ruling coalition to bring down Netanyahu.
I would like to make a personal appeal to the Defense Minister, Yoav. We have known each other for many years. Even when there were tensions between us, I have always respected and appreciated you. In this war, I have learnt to appreciate you even more. You are a brave and determined leader. Above all, you are a patriot. At this time, bravery and leadership are not just saying what is right, but doing what is right.
All right, Gallant so far, by the way, has not made the jump, although he did break with his Likud party in voting against a bill that paves the way for the ultra-Orthodox Haredi citizens to continue to dodge military service. The bill passed over the objections of Gallant and the families of hostages who were stared down during some heated debate by far-right finance minister Bezalel Smotrich.
It's possible to shut down an opinion that we don't like, but it does not make it disappear, nor does it dispense of the need to deal with it. We released Sinwar in the Shalit deal, and until today we buried 1,500 Jews because we released one man in the Shalit deal.
Shirley Sitbon, there's going to be casualties in war, says the far right in Israel. Therefore, continuing and continuing and continuing.
And even Gantz himself, when you heard his statement yesterday, he said the war will last several years, from what I understand. So he's not. He thinks that something can be achieved going further in this, and they're also counting in this also perhaps the north of Israel with Lebanon. But yeah, nobody among the officials, nobody's saying this is about to end with a victory soon. And even a deal, if they agree to a deal which will end with Israeli forces leaving Gaza, well, that will take a lot of time. That's not something that's going to be...
Okay, when Benjamin Netanyahu says we're going to eradicate Hamas, do Israelis believe that's actually possible?
They say it, but no, you hear more and more that it's not possible, that it's unlikely, but they want to reduce it to the minimum so it won't be as much of a threat. But even as the Israeli forces are there and are trying to protect the country, there's still rockets flying in as the war goes on. So what will happen? The Israelis imagine the retreat of the troops. What will happen the next day? Will everything start from scratch? Will Hamas rebuild extremely fast and will be able to attack and launch new attacks? So it's a lot of fear, a lot of people who are under immense stress, trauma. Nobody wants to fight a war, but they believe that they can achieve something more. That's, I guess, their belief in this. Of course, the Americans are trying to make them understand that it's impossible to beat Hamas, and you have to think about the next day, the following day, what will happen, how you can achieve some kind of security without having Israeli troops on the ground. So yes, that's what needs to be built now. When Gantz talked about the day after the war, what will happen in the Gaza Strip, what will the situation be like? Well, the Americans want to define this clearly with the Israeli leadership.
And the deal is on the table, or it's been put on the table. It's the Saudis will recognize you, will have reconstruction. You need to recognize a two-state solution. Ronnie Brahman, there was this window right about a month ago, roughly, where people started to think, well, maybe there's something on the table? Were you ever at all optimistic?
No, not at all, not at all. Who can believe that the destruction caused by Israel are going to be paid for by the rest of the world, by the Arab world, which has nothing to do with what happened in Gaza? It's just unimaginable. And just to come back to the beginning of this program, when we saw Antony Blinken in Israel, I think that it's time to recognize that the U.S. over this specific issue has lost its entire credibility. I mean, they're talking, but it's only words. They're never followed by concrete measures, and they're not heard. They're not listened to. Blinken speaks. He's cheered when he comes to Israel. Okay, it's fine. He's an ally, but he speaks in the empty. Nobody is listening to him. So it's a very important ordeal for the U.S. diplomacy these days, and they are being ridiculed by the Israelis.
Ahmed Fouad Al-Khatib, what's going on inside of the State Department, inside of the White House? We've asked this question before, but what's the calculation?
Well, I think some of the folks in D.C. are suggesting that a lot of the decisions have been kind of like the State Department in a way has been hollowed out, and a lot of the decisions have moved from state to the White House under the direction, if you will, of Mr. Sullivan.
Because you heard there, Roni Broman saying that Netanyahu's just counting the days till November and hoping that Donald Trump returns.
And that's the challenge of not having decisive U.S. leadership that, using the classic carrot and stick approach. Unfortunately, the Israeli government has faced virtually no consequences for not, working with the United States to develop sound day after plans. What's happening right now, again, is that the State Department really is not in control of much of the policy when it comes to, of course, Secretary Blinken is involved, but you do have the White House and the National Security Council taking leadership, in my opinion and my assessment. But going back to what we're experiencing in Gaza right now is the direct result of Netanyahu's intransigent insistence that nothing substantial or meaningful or reasonable or sound be implemented to create an alternative to Hamas. Of course, Hamas is going to come back. Of course, they're going to reconstitute. Of course, they're going to rebuild. Listen, man, I grew up in Gaza when Yahya Ayyash and Ahmed Yassin, the group's founder, was assassinated. Abdulaziz al-Rantisi, Abu Shanab, all of these serious, Salah Shahada, the founder of the militant wing in 2002. I was in Gaza when he was assassinated. And everybody thought, oh, this is the beginning of the end of Hamas. This is we've seen iterations of this war. Obviously, this is the most destructive in recent history. But what hasn't been learned thus far by a lot of these strategic circles within Israel and elsewhere is that Hamas absolutely has this ability to reconstitute and rebuild. And as we speak right now, Hamas teams, they have mobile teams that are going around. They're collecting unexploded munitions. These are rockets or bombs that didn't go off from the air or from the sea or land, and they're recycling them. They're taking out the explosive materials inside of these things, and they're finding, other materials like aluminum tubes or pipes from destroyed buildings, and they're making new munitions for them to push forward. So this is what happens when you don't give the population an alternative or an incentive to work with you to actually be a part of overthrowing Hamas. And the State Department, unfortunately, has let Netanyahu off the hook, has not had any serious consequences for his failures in agreeing to serious day after plans.
Okay, so let me ask you about this, Ahmed, because we heard earlier that clip of the far-right finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, his basically employing this war is hell fatalistic stance. The Wall Street Journal is reporting that it's seen intercepted correspondence by Hamas's operational leader in the Gaza Strip, Yahya Sinwar, who allegedly calculates that civilian casualties work to his advantage. Your thoughts on that, and how do ordinary Palestinians feel about that?
Well, this is why I've been so overtly and ferociously anti-Hamas and an outspoken critic. Because yes, I mean, directly and indirectly, they figure that the more civilian casualties, the merrier for them, because that gets used to fuel anti-Israel sentiments, which in turn gets used, it becomes political pressure against the United States and against Israel. And it is part of the fuel, if you will, to delegitimize Israel in the medium and long terms. And that is not a sound strategy. That is not a liberation strategy. And that is something that a lot of Palestinians in Gaza are aware of. Obviously, they can't speak out. They can't, but they're not silly. They're not stupid. They know this. They've been through wars in 2008, 2014, 2012, 2021. Unfortunately, this is what makes Hamas incredibly deadly. And we've seen the failure of the blockade over the years, not just to stop Hamas from acquiring the munitions and the precursor materials, but from generating the popular and public pressure against the Islamist group to kind of change ship or to change its strategy or to abandon armed resistance. Hamas does not care about the people in Gaza, period, end of story. If that's not clear to the pro-Palestine activists or to policymakers in Israel or to the entire world, I don't know what it would take to make that clear. So yes, on the one hand, that is true. On the other hand, that should mean we should change the strategy. We should not apply this scorched earth strategy in fighting this war, destroying entire neighborhoods, destroying the hospitals, destroying the schools, making Gaza uninhabitable, thinking that that somehow is going to prevent Hamas from reconstituting, or that somehow makes the population less likely to support Hamas, because Hamas doesn't care about the civilian casualties. The population are already resentful of Hamas. There will be a reckoning the minute this war stops. You're going to see the people of Gaza speak out against Hamas, challenge the group, asking them, what has all of this been for? We've destroyed us. And now basically all that Hamas wants to do is go back to October 6th. Is, oh, well, we want the evacuation of Israeli soldiers. Well, no Israeli soldiers were inside Gaza before October 7th. Oh, well, we want the reconstruction of Gaza. Well, Gaza was pretty darn reconstructed and pretty well developed, despite its challenges, despite its issues. So that's where the ending of the war is actually going to serve the cause of undermining Hamas. But the perpetuation of the war and the danger of perpetual military occupation in Gaza, permanent Israeli forces present in Gaza, that's actually Hamas's raison d'etre, is armed resistance and liberation. That's actually going to fuel Hamas 2.0, where they might not be the cohesive government that we saw on October 6th or before the massacre, but they're going to actually go back to being a resistance group and operating in these small cells that attack Israeli troops, and it's going to be horrendous for the civilian population in Gaza.
Shirley Sitbon, you can understand October 8th if you're an Israeli, you've just come off the deadliest, the bloodiest day in the country's history, that you can be blinded by rage at that point. But again, I come back to this question, listening there to what Ahmed was saying. Israelis, are they still blinded by rage today, or are they hearing what Ahmed just said?
And I sometimes find it difficult to understand, just like you, because I live here. But there's this fear, this feeling, when you keep hearing it, that Hamas can be beaten, that people like you said, you talked about Gantz and Gallant, people who are respected for their military careers. Gantz was the last man to get out when Israel left the south of Lebanon. He was the one who closed the gate. So he's somebody who people think could be trusted. So if he says that there is a way of obtaining these goals that they're talking about, which everyone else in the world says are not attainable, the fact of crushing Hamas, making it not exist anymore without any alternative being built and brought in. Well, if people like that keep saying that, and that's all you hear all day long, if you don't, and with today's algorithms, that's all you get also on social media, then yeah, maybe people really continue to believe that there's no other alternative. What can you do? What if you leave, then the rockets will get stronger, more powerful. powerful. There'll be new infiltrations, new attacks, new wars. So maybe they think there is no other alternative. Of course, although everyone else says there is, that the fact that they're crushing the Gaza Strip, well, it creates also hatred and a lot of resentment and tomorrow's terrorists, etc., tomorrow's fighters. So yeah, maybe if you keep hearing that, then you want to believe it. You want to believe there's a solution, and that is the solution.
There's, as we've mentioned since the beginning, this Security Council resolution at the outset, the departure of Gantz and Eisenkot from the War Cabinet, and the talk of that weekend rescue of 4 Israeli hostages, that it could well be a one-off, which came at a very high price, several dozen lives of Palestinian civilians, and it could be impossible to replicate. Tom Kennedy has more.
The commander of the Yamam unit leads these soldiers into a building under heavy fire. The IDF has released these images depicting the inside of an apartment. The sound is cut and the guards are killed, which isn't shown in the video. Then they reach the hostages' room.
Who are you? Tell me your names. Almug, Andre. Okay, there are 3. Everything's okay. We're here to save you. Remain calm.
Terrified faces on these hostages. The commander extracts them, and we see them run away under cover fire. The operation took place in a densely populated neighbourhood close to a market. The Israeli army says Hamas opened fire with grenade launchers in the street. A death toll of 274, including women and children, according to the Hamas-run health ministry.
The occupying forces targeted civilians at the Nusrat camp, full of sellers, crying and hiding.
The Israeli army noted a death toll of around 100, saying it doesn't know how many were fighters. The hostages confirmed they were held in apartments and not tunnels. Some were held in the family home of a Palestinian doctor and his journalist son.
Khadib Roman, your reaction watching that report?
It's an absolute disaster. In Gaza, things are only going from bad to worse. And the death toll in this military operation, which, if I understood well, was not aimed at liberating hostages, but at killing Hamas activists, and in a way by accident they liberated, which is a good thing. I mean, everybody has to be pleased with this, but we have to understand that for the Israeli army in Gaza, at least, and maybe in the West Bank as well.
Israel's claiming that for weeks it had been planning, that it had seen that there was a window of opportunity to try to rescue these hostages.
But what I see, this is a kind of ex post narrative. I heard something else, which I read in Haaretz, by the way. Anyway, they've been released, they've been freed, and that's a very good thing. But the toll which was exacted by this operation is absolutely horrendous. 272 dead, and several hundred were wounded. And this is a way for me to recall that there are more or less 3 categories of Palestinians in the eyes of the Israeli army in Gaza. You have the human shields, which you can kill, but you regret, you shoot and cry in a way. You have the accomplices, which you have to shoot at, and you have the terrorists. So the 3 categories of Palestinians are legitimate targets. One, and the human shields, are regrettable in a way, legitimate target, and the other ones are legitimate target. So it's an endless process of death. And as Shirley was saying, we're sowing hatred and resentment and creating a new generation of people who will have only one idea in mind, is to revenge, to kill as many Israeli Jews as possible. This is the future which is being prepared now in Gaza.
Again, I ask about Israeli public opinion. Is Shirley Sitbon, is there the idea that there can be more of these rescue operations, or is the idea that the toll was so high that this is a one-off and that maybe now's the time to...
They're not, in Israel, from what I saw, they don't really talk about the toll. They did say it, but they say that other countries are focusing on the toll when they're not focusing on the amazing rescue that is so unbelievable that they can get out of there alive with only one policeman dead. And how can foreign media just focus on all of these Palestinian deaths? So they talk about it, but they don't understand. I mean, they don't voice the horror of it. But when you talk about what people say, do they think that 120 people, hostages, can be released that way? No, they've said it over and over again. People, the experts on Israeli television, media, and the hostages' families, they say, we don't want all of these people to be rescued. It's impossible. There needs to be a deal. There needs to be a swap. That's the only way to get the maximum number of hostages alive out of Gaza. And they've said it from the beginning. Even the mother of one of the hostages was released. She said, we want a deal. We want everyone to be released like my son was released. And people are saying, these hostages were outside in residential buildings. The others are in tunnels, many of them. And Hamas said that now that Israel has managed to release these people, everyone's going to be in tunnels.
Okay, so Shirley, let me ask you. After the UN Security Council resolution, after Benny Gantz quitting the war cabinet, after the high casualty toll in getting 4 hostages out, has the needle moved at all? Are we closer to a ceasefire deal?
I guess it's difficult to know what's in Netanyahu's spirits, because we know that he doesn't want everything to end now. He doesn't want elections now. He wants things to drag on. Will they limit the number of raids so the U.S. can accept it? Will they drag on some kind of deal that will last many, many, many months with just a very small number of hostages released every week or every month? I don't know. But we know that he doesn't want to leave right away. We know he doesn't have a majority according to polls now, opinion polls. So does his decision-making depend largely on that? If that's the case, then no, it's not going to stop it now. But if he thinks about greater things, about finding ways with the international community, I mean, Israel has been criticized so much across the world. He risks things himself. I mean, will that make his position shift?
Does Israel care about that international public opinion at this point, or is it an us versus them mentality that they're digging in?
Both, I think. It's us versus them. They don't understand us. How can they be blind? And at the same time saying, oh, well, we actually can't go, we won't be able to go anywhere around the world. And also, thinking, well, what are we not getting here? I mean, to us, it seems obvious that we need to stop Hamas. Of course, there are Palestinian casualties, but this is war. This is a war of survival. They don't understand sometimes, but they do see that it's getting more and more complicated. We saw here in France, the Israeli defense companies used to be the stars of the defense show here, and now they've been excluded from it. So it starts to have consequences, and Israelis see that it's going to be more and more significant.
If I may, I think Israel doesn't care much about the outside criticism, as Shirley said. I mean, the general discourse is nobody understands us. We are surrounded by enemies. We have to defend ourselves, and the Holocaust won't happen again, etc., etc. So they don't give a damn about the public criticism, but their allies do. The US ally and the European ally. And I think they might be sensitive to the accusation of committing a genocide in Israel and running the risk of being accused of complicity with acts of genocide committed in Gaza. So I think that might influence the course of the war.
There's a lot of fog of war as well, Hannibal.
Yeah, sure.
Let me ask you, for instance, the charge leveled, and we heard it again from the Egyptian president at that conference taking place in Jordan this Tuesday, saying that there's starvation in the Gaza Strip. What are people from MSF telling you as far as that?
Yeah, they confirmed this. Of course,
to this day.
Of course, there's starvation. There is a systematic obstruction to food aid convoys. There is no possibility whatsoever to cultivate anything, to produce, to grow any food in Gaza. How come? I mean, how would it be possible that Gazans find food to feed themselves? No, there is starvation, and there is deliberate, intentional starvation, which aggravates the judicial case, the legal case of Israel before the International Courts of Justice.
Some of those border crossings have reopened. We now have this pier Is the situation of today the same as it was a few months back?
Well, the pier was a ridiculous thing. We all know, everybody knows that there is only one way to distribute food aid or humanitarian aid in general, which is by road and through the Rafah crossing. The pier, the cost of the pier is more than $300 million, which is as many dollars which are subtracted from food aid, and it's contingent on the weather. And it was stopped during more than 10 days lately because the weather was bad. There was too many rains. The barges were on the beach of Gaza. It was just ridiculous. So a very small amount of food gets to Gaza through this pier. Same applies to Kerem Shalom. There are a few convoys which have reached Kerem Shalom, but it's a war zone. So you can't distribute food in a war zone. So the only way to stop starvation is a ceasefire. There is no alternative to this. There is no way out to this.
Ahmed Fouad Al-Khatib, tell us, what are people telling you when it comes to receiving food aid? Is the situation improving, the same, getting worse?
In some areas, it has improved. In some areas, it has gotten worse. Absolutely. The areas in central Gaza right now that are facing a lot more military operations, the areas in southern Gaza near Rafah, it's absolutely worse. I mean, and with the decommissioning of the Rafah border crossing, that has shrunk significantly the number of aid trucks going in. But one of the things that I learned recently about the challenges is that there's only something like 200 trucks inside Gaza that are actually capable of collecting the aid, putting it on the trucks, and then distributing it to the various parts. So one of the pushes that I've been trying to do for behind the scenes is to actually bring in more of these large trucks inside Gaza to be able to be used for distribution. Yes, when it comes to the local cultivation and agriculture, it's been absolutely decimated. I mean, before the war, Gaza actually used to have quite a vibrant agricultural sector that has now all but collapsed. And this is one of the challenges with the no-go zone, the buffer zone that Israel has implemented, the 1 kilometer inside Gaza, all around the border, is that those are some of the most fertile agricultural lands in Gaza. And if you're going to do this long term, you're going to rob the coastal enclave not only of valuable territory and people's homes, but of areas that you can use for self-sufficiency. The other thing, too, is that you have the danger, you have the gangs, you have the breakdown in law and order, you have the logistical problems, you have the just inability to reach certain areas. But the main issue right now is that you don't have predictability, you don't have regularity, you don't have a consistency when it comes to access to food aid. And that's why we need an actual ceasefire and an end to this war. Otherwise, this cannot go on. This will only get worse. The malnutrition. The other thing, too, is people think, I mean, it's one thing to have access to food, but what do you have access to? It's a lot of carbohydrates. You have powdered milk. You have very little nutritional. You don't have nutritional dense materials. And all of these children I mean, you can sustain them, but they're not exactly developing. They're not accessing the vital minerals and the vitamins that their bodies need. And I saw that with my own nieces and nephews, whom I helped get out of Gaza one day before the Rafah border closed. I mean, they lost half of their weights. They were extraordinarily, like my niece, Maria, who's 3 at this point. She has the body of a 1-year-old. She lost all of her body mass. She was extremely malnourished. And my brother is better off than most because he works for the international community. You can only imagine what it's like for the rest of the population. This cannot go on. 8 months later, it's only gotten worse in some regards, and it's going to keep getting worse until we stop this war.
So, Fouad, we're running short on Ahmed Fouad Al-Khatib. We're running short on time. And so I have to ask you, is there a scenario under which we swing away from this things getting worse, where we swing away from further polarization, where the dehumanization that we've been describing ends?
Absolutely. And I've experienced that also firsthand by speaking out and putting myself out there, connecting with Israeli hostage families and families of victims of October 7th, humanizing the Israeli victims to the world as a Palestinian who lost over 31 family members, who grew up there, whose family is there, who grew up in there and has carries battle scars from my growth. I'm largely deaf in my left ear from an IDF bombing that almost killed me and killed two of my friends when I was 11. So I know war firsthand. That's why I push for peace and the rebranding of peace and coexistence. Not as Hamas and others say is a cowardly, treacherous act, but as the ultimate act of courage and a necessary evolution to preserve the Palestinian people on their land. And so the dehumanization is also a two-way street where we see the dehumanization of the Palestinian people, the dismissal of the victims, and saying they're all terrorists, they're all Hamas, there are no uninvolved civilians. They're all, especially after this raid to liberate the hostages, something that I support, but was appalled by the horrendous price. People are saying, oh, look, they were at civilians' homes. So this somehow proves that there really are no innocent civilians. This is wrong. Hamas abuses the civilian population in Gaza, but also there are, of course, Hamas supporters and allies in the Strip. That doesn't mean we dismiss 2.3 million as all combatants and as all involved in the militancy. I see an off-ramp, both from an ethos point of view, for the two people to realize that Palestinians and Israelis are here to stay. Neither one is going away. There are just and urgent aspirations for the Palestinian people for liberty, for justice, for independence, sovereignty, and equality. And there are also just and legitimate needs for the Israeli people to live in security, to not face terrorism, to not face what happened on October 7th, and to also to have their sense of belonging legitimized in the land, not at the expense of the Palestinian people, but in parallel. The other thing, too, just real quickly on Gaza, and I know we're out of time, there's an off-ramp through bringing in an international police-keeping force or peacekeeping force, whichever one you want to call it, but that can have a limited mandate that gradually starts to expand. First, by spreading them along the borders to disengage the Palestinians and Israelis, to not have that buffer zone, that's the 1 kilometer buffer zone, to take away the need for direct Israeli military occupation that's going to make Hamas 2.0 relevant, and then to create, I call them humanitarian clusters or islands of stability within Gaza to help with the distribution of humanitarian aid, to help the Palestinians reorganize administratively and otherwise, to help bring in outside forces like the Palestinian Authority, like a technocratic government, and to ensure that there can be safety provided to those who want an alternative to Hamas. And that can gradually expand and grow.
And just very, very briefly on this, Ahmed, I have to ask you, because earlier we heard Shirley Sitbon talking about echo chambers, algorithms. You're sitting in San Francisco. You can see Silicon Valley from your window practically. How do you break down those echo chambers?
Sometimes it's important to remember that social media is not the real world. Social media has empowered me and empowered others to access information, but we have to step away from social media. We have to connect with those with whom we disagree. We have to build bridges. We have to realize that this polarization, which is true not just with Israel and Palestine, but across, look at Europe, look at the elections in the United States. We have to step away from social media. We have to remember there are human beings on the other end and that we're all here to stay. And I'm optimistic. That's why I'm putting myself out there. That's why I'm active online and elsewhere. And that's why I force myself to step away from social media and the algorithms, because in real life, even when I meet pro-Israel folks or right-wing, center-right, centrist, or liberal Zionists, we share a common humanity. We share a desire for peace and coexistence, and we share a desire to move us past this horrendous time for both people, and especially for the people of Gaza. And optimistic that there's a there. We just gotta step away from the polarization and dehumanization.
And hope that it's sooner than later. Ahmed Fouad Al-Khatib, many thanks for being with us from San Francisco. I want to thank Roni Broman, Shirley Sitbon. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.